A Marine corporal blocked her path, arms crossed, lips already curling into a smirk. "Ma'am, the press briefing is 2 buildings over," his buddy laughed. She didn't respond. She just looked at him, calm, steady, like she was reading a target. And in that moment, she already knew something he didn't. Before sunrise, 17 men would be dead. Every single operator standing in that room would owe her their life. Before we go any further, if this story hits you the way it hits me, please subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The convoy came in low and fast the way everything did at FOB Rhino. 3 armored vehicles, dust-coated and battle-worn, rolling through the main gate just as the Afghan sun began its slow, brutal climb over the ridgeline. The gate guards were already sweating through their body armor before 8 in the morning. Private First Class Danny Kowalski had been on checkpoint duty since 0400, and he was in no mood for complications. He saw the vehicles. He saw the soldiers. He checked the manifest. And then he saw her. She stepped out of the second vehicle, not dramatically, not slowly, not the way someone steps out of a car when they want people to look. She just stepped out. Small backpack over one shoulder. Civilian clothes, dark hair pulled back. No rank insignia, no weapon, no unit patch, no explanation. She looked in every possible way like someone who had taken a very wrong turn. Kowalski looked down at his clipboard, then back up. "Ma'am," he said it the way you'd say it to a lost tourist. Skeptical, slightly irritated, already prepared to redirect her to wherever civilians were supposed to be. "This is a restricted area. You're going to need to tell me who you are and why you're here." She reached into her jacket pocket and produced a single laminated identification card. No expression on her face, no urgency. She handed it over the way most people hand over a library card. Kowalski studied it. His eyebrows came together slowly the way a man's do when something doesn't quite compute. The clearance level on that card was above anything he had ever personally processed at this checkpoint. Not just high, stratospheric. "CW5, he said, reading the rank designation. "Chief Warrant Officer 5, one of the rarest designations in the United States military. Less common than generals, harder to earn than almost any rank in the armed forces." She said nothing. "And your unit designation is..." He squinted. Half of the field was redacted. Black bars over black bars. He looked up at her. She was already looking past him into the base, like she was cataloging it. "Welcome to FOB Rhino," he finally said, handing the card back. She took it without a word and walked through the gate. Behind her, Kowalski's buddy, a young lance corporal named Travers, who had been watching the whole thing, leaned over and said, "The hell was that about?" Kowalski shook his head. "No idea." "She looks like somebody's mom." Kowalski didn't laugh, but he didn't disagree either. She moved through this base with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this before. Not here, not this base, not this exact configuration of buildings and barriers, but this situation. Being new somewhere, being watched, being assessed by people who had already made up their minds before she opened her mouth. She had been doing this for 19 years. The Tactical Operations Center, the TOC, was the nerve center of FOB Rhino, and it was exactly where she was headed. She had been given coordinates, a time, and nothing else. That was standard. That was always standard. The people who sent her never gave more information than the absolute minimum required because information was weight, and in her line of work, you traveled light. She pushed open the door to the TOC. The noise inside was a layered thing: radio chatter, someone arguing over a map, the click and hum of equipment being tested, boots on concrete, the low bass of men who had been living in close quarters long enough to stop being polite about volume. There were perhaps 30 people in the room, SEALs in their characteristic, quiet professional gear. Delta operators who looked like they'd been assembled from spare parts and pure stubbornness. Rangers, Marine Recon veterans, intelligence officers, coordinators. Every single one of them was male. She walked in and the noise didn't stop. Not immediately. It continued for a few seconds, and then like a wave rolling back from shore, it began to quiet. Not because anyone announced her, not because anyone called the room to attention, but because humans, regardless of training, have a fundamental instinct to notice the thing that doesn't fit the pattern. She was the thing that didn't fit the pattern. First Lieutenant Garrett Walsh, a Marine recon officer with 8 years of service, and the kind of jaw that looked like it had been chiseled specifically for the purpose of looking skeptical, was the first one to say anything. "Excuse me." Not rude, not polite, somewhere in the middle where condescension lives. "This is a restricted tactical briefing space. Are you looking for the—" "I know where I am," she said. Her voice was even, not cold exactly, but controlled in a way that very few voices ever are. Like every word had been measured before it left her mouth and found to be precisely the right weight. Walsh blinked. "Ma'am, I don't have you on the manifest for this brief." "Then someone needs to update your manifest." She moved toward an open section of wall and set her backpack down against it, not at a desk, not at a station, just along the wall, like she was comfortable being in the margins, like she had spent a very long time being comfortable in places where most people couldn't breathe. A Navy SEAL named Lieutenant Commander Brian Bull Hendricks, 6'4", built like a piece of industrial equipment, with a beard that would have been regulation violating on anyone who couldn't bench press. A small car walked over to her. His approach was the kind that's meant to communicate something without saying it directly. He was a large man moving toward a small woman, and in his experience, that usually resolved questions about authority fairly quickly. "Listen," he said, keeping his voice reasonable in the way that people do when they've decided to be generous about a mistake. "We've got a high-value target mission briefing in about 20 minutes. This room is going to be need-to-know only. If you're press, or if you're visiting from a policy office, I can have someone escort you to—" "Chief Warrant Officer 5, Alexandra Reyes," she said. She didn't look at him when she said it. She was looking at the tactical map on the far wall. "I'm not press. I'm not a policy visitor. I'm your Overwatch." The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. Bull Hendricks stood there for a moment with his mouth not quite closed. Then he let out a short, involuntary laugh. Not a mean laugh, more like the laugh a person makes when they've heard a joke and are still processing whether it's funny. "Overwatch," he said the word carefully. "You're our Overwatch." "That's what I said." "Ma'am, with all due respect." "With all due respect usually means what follows isn't respectful," she said, still looking at the map. Someone near the back of the room made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Walsh turned around to find the source. Whoever it was found something interesting to look at on the floor. Hendricks put his hands on his hips. This was his thinking posture. His team knew it. When Bull Hendricks put his hands on his hips, it meant he was recalculating. "The mission calls for long-range sniper overwatch. Primary position is going to be 1,800 to 2,000 meters from the objective. In terrain that is frankly not forgiving. The operator filling that role needs to have 1,800 meters from the primary objective puts the overwatch position at grid reference 479er Alpha," she said, still looking at the map. "Elevation approximately 340 meters above target elevation. Wind at that altitude will run predominantly northeast at this time of year, variable between 12 and 22 knots, depending on time of night. There's a secondary ridge at 2,300 meters that offers better angle on the eastern approach, but requires a longer shot and has a narrower window before the angle degrades past usable. You'll want a primary and a secondary position designated before insertion. Probably a tertiary as a fallback. Though the terrain northwest of the compound doesn't give you great options, you're going to be shooting through a gap in the ridgeline, and the margin for error on wind compensation drops significantly." The room was very, very quiet. She turned and looked at Hendricks for the first time directly. Her eyes were dark and steady. "That's what you were going to say the operator needs to know, wasn't it?" "Something like that." Bull Hendricks closed his mouth, opened it again, closed it. The map she had just described with that level of precision was on the wall behind her. She hadn't looked at it since she started talking. The briefing that followed was, by the accounts of everyone present, one of the stranger experiences of their military careers. And these were people whose careers had included things that would rearrange the thinking of most civilians permanently. Major Dennis Kraft, the intelligence officer running the brief, had gone through his presentation with the careful efficiency of a man who had delivered classified information in high-stakes environments enough times to have the emotional steadiness of a metronome. He covered the target, a high-value insurgent commander named Rahimullah, responsible for coordinating attacks across 3 provinces, currently located in a fortified compound in the Helmand River Valley, with what intelligence estimated to be between 12 and 20 armed fighters and 2 confirmed hostages. The assault plan was a joint operation. SEAL Team 6 would breach the compound from the south. Rangers would handle the perimeter. Delta operators would extract the hostages. The operation required total silence and speed. And the one gap in the plan, the one vulnerability that had been giving the planning team migraines for 2 weeks was the eastern approach. The compound sat in a bowl of terrain. In the eastern face of that bowl was a long, open slope. If any of Rahimullah's fighters managed to get word out before the breach, reinforcements could come from the Eastern Valley Road within minutes. And if those reinforcements arrived while the assault team was still inside, the casualty math got very ugly very fast. The solution in theory was long-range overwatch. Someone positioned on the ridgeline far enough back to have angle on the entire eastern approach, capable of engaging targets at distance with the kind of precision that a suppressed shot in the night required. The problem was the distance. The primary position Kraft had identified was at 1,900 meters. The secondary, which covered the road approach, was at 2,200. Those distances weren't impossible, but they were the kind of distances where the margin between a good sniper and an exceptional sniper was measured in lives. Sergeant First Class Kevin Doyle, one of the Rangers, raised his hand during the Overwatch section of the brief. "Sir, who do we have for the long position? Because I want to be honest, 1,900 meters with variable wind at night is not a straightforward assignment." Major Kraft looked at the woman sitting along the wall. "Chief Warrant Officer Reyes will be providing overwatch." The reaction in the room was fragmented. Some people said nothing. A few exchanged looks that communicated entire conversations. Doyle himself turned around and looked at her with an expression that was trying very hard not to be what it actually was. "Chief Warrant Officer Reyes," he said slowly, like he was learning the name for the first time. "What's your background for long range?" She looked at him. "Long enough. That's not really, yeah. If you're asking whether I've shot at these distances before," she said, "yes. If you're asking whether I've done it in operational conditions, yes. If you're asking whether you can trust me to cover your approach tonight, I would suggest that question answers itself when you come home." Doyle sat back in his chair. He had the look of a man who had started a conversation expecting to win it and was now reassessing. The brief continued. But during the rest of it, while Kraft walked through extraction routes and contingency plans and radio protocols, a number of eyes kept returning to her. Watching, measuring. She didn't notice, or if she did, she gave no indication. She was studying the map with the focused attention of someone committing it to the kind of memory that doesn't degrade under pressure. It was Master Sergeant Randy Pollock who suggested the range. Pollock was Delta Force, which meant he had been around long enough and seen enough that he didn't typically feel the need to prove things or challenge people. But he also had 17 men going into a compound tonight under the protection of an Overwatch shooter he had never heard of, never worked with, and never seen perform. And in his experience, the difference between an Overwatch operator who was good and one who was elite was not a small difference. It was a survive or don't difference. He found her after the brief when she was standing outside studying the ridgeline to the north of the base with the calm attention of someone who found natural terrain genuinely interesting. "Chief Warrant Officer Reyes," he said. She turned. Randy Pollock. He didn't offer his hand, not because he was being rude, but because in this context names were enough. "I've got people going into the valley tonight." "I know," she said. "I'd like to watch you shoot before we put them on those helicopters." She studied him for a moment. He was a big man, Pollock, not in the manufactured at a gym way, but in the way that comes from 20 years of functional work. His face was the face of someone who had learned to read people the way other people learn to read books. He wasn't challenging her, he was asking. "Okay," she said. The range at FOB Rhino was functional rather than elaborate. A cleared stretch of ground with paper targets at designated distances, berm walls, and a handful of shooting positions. It was used primarily for zero checking and familiarization, not the kind of precision, long-range work that operational snipers required. But it was what they had. Word travels fast in a small base. By the time they reached the range, there were 14 people who had found reasons to be in the general vicinity. Some of them were conspicuously casual about it, leaning against barriers or checking equipment that didn't need checking, having very interested conversations with each other while facing the range. A few didn't bother pretending. They stood and watched. Bull Hendricks was there. Walsh was there. Doyle was there. She picked up the rifle, a standard configuration M201. That had been signed out from the armory and spent 2 minutes examining it. Not quickly, carefully. The way a musician picks up an instrument they've never played before and checks its character before committing. She adjusted the stock. She checked the scope. She did something to the trigger tension that made Pollock, who was standing closest, pay very close attention. 800 meters first, Pollock said. Paper target, standard silhouette. She lay down into position. No drama, no visible ritual. She was just down, settled still. The shot came 30 seconds later. Pollock walked the target back and looked at the hole, center of the silhouette, and then he looked more carefully. He walked back. "Do it again," he said. His voice was careful. She fired again. He walked the target back again and brought it close to his face. The second hole was inside the first hole, not adjacent, inside. He looked up at her. "One more." She fired. He walked to the target, and this time he held it up for the people watching because he understood they needed to see it. 3 rounds, 1 hole. Someone said quietly, "What?" Pollock set the target down. 1,200, he said. His voice had changed, not dramatically, but anyone who knew him could hear it. She made 2 adjustments to the scope. No calculator, no digital assistance. Her lips moved slightly, the way someone's lips move when they are doing an arithmetic in their head that other people need paper to do. She fired. Then again, Pollock looked at both impacts through his spotting scope and was quiet for a long time. "She's holding a 6-inch group at 1,200, he said finally to no one in particular, without a wind meter, with a rifle she's never shot before. Walsh behind him said nothing. Doyle said nothing. Bull Hendricks, who had been watching with his arms crossed and his jaw set slowly, uncrossed his arms. From somewhere behind the small gathered crowd came a voice, an older voice with the particular cadence of the American South and the weight of someone who had spent a great deal of time making measurements of human skill. "Lord above," everyone turned. Sergeant Major Marcus Chen, retired, visiting FOB Rhino as part of a combat advisory rotation, and arguably the most decorated long-range sniper instructor in Marine Corps history, was standing at the edge of the range. He had white at his temples and the lean, economical build of a man whose body had been optimized over decades for precisely one purpose. He was looking at the target in Pollock's hand. "Let me see that," he said. Pollock handed it over. Chen looked at Ed for a very long time. Then he looked at the woman on the firing line, who was already beginning to break down the rifle with the mechanical efficiency of someone for whom the entire exercise had been routine. "What's her name?" Chen asked. "Reyes," Pollock said. "CW5. Chen looked at the target again, then back at her. "I've been teaching precision fire for 22 years, he said. He said it quietly, not performing it, just stating a fact that needed to be on the record. "I have trained some of the finest long-range shooters this country has produced." He paused. "I have never taught her, and I do not know where she learned to do what she just did. But I want you all to understand something very clearly." He looked around at the assembled operators. "What you just watched is not something that can be taught in a standard program. What you just watched is not something that most people with unlimited time and resources could ever do." He folded the target carefully and handed it back to Pollock. "Whatever you need from this woman tonight, I suggest you let her provide it, and I suggest you treat her accordingly." He walked away. The range was very quiet. She finished breaking down the rifle, packed it into its case, and stood up. She looked at the gathered operators with the same composed, unreadable expression she had worn all day. "We need to talk about insertion timing," she said. "If I'm going to be on position before the assault team reaches the compound, I need to be on the helicopters 30 minutes earlier than the current manifest shows." She looked at Pollock. "Can that be arranged?" Pollock looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. "Yes, Chief Warrant Officer," and he said, "It can." And for the first time that day, the men around her, the SEALs and the Rangers and the Delta operators and the Marine Recon veterans, the men who had laughed and questioned and measured and doubted, heard the word Chief Warrant Officer used the way it was always supposed to be used, like a title that had been earned in ways most people would never understand, by methods most people would never see, at distances most people could not imagine. She picked up her rifle case and walked back toward the TOC. Behind her, nobody said a word for a very long time. Later in the hours before the mission, she sat alone in a corner of the equipment room, going through her gear with the slow, methodical attention of someone who had learned through experience that leaves marks that the difference between coming home and not coming home was almost always in the details. Pollock found her there. He sat down across from her without asking permission, which she appreciated because asking would have made it formal, and she was tired of formal. "How long?" he said. She didn't look up from the scope she was cleaning. 19 years. "How many deployments?" She paused very slightly. "Enough." He was quiet for a moment. "Iraq." "Yes." "Syria." She looked up at him then. "There are some answers I'm not authorized to give you, Master Sergeant." He nodded. He understood classified. He lived classified. "Did it bother you today, the reception?" She thought about it. Not whether to answer she was already deciding to answer, but what the honest answer actually was. "It used to," she said. "It doesn't anymore." "Why not?" She set down the scope and looked at him with the direct, unadorned honesty of someone who has been through enough to have stopped performing emotions they don't actually feel. "Because they're going to be alive tomorrow," she said. "Whatever they thought of me when I walked in that gate doesn't change that. I'm going to be on that ridge tonight, and they're going to come home, and that's the only part that matters." Pollock was quiet for a while. "You've done this before," he said. "The solo, the long position." "Yes." "It's a particular kind of alone," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked at him with something that might in another context have been called surprise. "Yeah," she said. "It is. How do you manage it?" She picked the scope back up. "You stay focused on the mission," she said. "You stay focused on the people you're covering. You don't think about the alone. You think about the job." Pollock nodded slowly. He stood up. "We push off at 2200. "I know." He started to leave. Then he stopped. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm glad you're on that ridge." She didn't look up. "Get some rest, Master Sergeant," she said. "You're going to need it." He left her there in the equipment room alone with her gear, in the night pressing in from outside in the mission that was coming, whether anyone was ready for it or not. And she sat there in the quiet and checked each piece of equipment one more time. Not because she needed to, but because that was how you respected the work. That was how you made sure the people depending on you came home. That was who she was, not a legend she had asked to become, not a symbol anyone had voted on, not a statement anyone had planned. Just a woman with a rifle and 19 years in a particular kind of stillness that the right kind of darkness had built in her piece by piece, deployment by deployment, shot by shot, in the places no one talked about, in the missions no one confirmed. The night was coming, and she was ready. The helicopters lifted off at 2200 hours exactly. She was already gone. True to the adjusted manifest Pollock had pushed through, she had departed 32 minutes earlier on a smaller bird, a stripped-down little bird that dropped her and her gear at a designated landing zone 6 kilometers from the compound in darkness, so complete that the pilots were flying entirely on instruments and instinct. She had stepped off that helicopter without a word, without a backward glance, and disappeared into the Afghan night like she had been absorbed by it. That was the last anyone saw of her before the mission began. On the main helicopters, the assault team rode in the particular silence that precedes violent action. Not the silence of peace, the silence of men who have been here before and know that talking uses energy that the next few hours are going to demand back with interest. SEALs checked their gear for the 4th and 5th time. Rangers adjusted straps and rechecked radio frequencies. Delta operators sat with their eyes closed, not sleeping, running through sequences in their minds, mapping decisions to contingencies, rehearsing violence with the quiet discipline of professionals. Bull Hendricks sat near the rear of the aircraft with his team leader, Lieutenant Junior Grade Marcus Webb, a 28-year-old from Georgia who had the calm of someone twice his age and the instincts of someone who had been born for exactly this kind of work. Webb was looking at a small, laminated map card, tracing routes with one finger. "You keep thinking about the ridge," Hendricks said. "Not a question." Webb looked up. "You're not." Hendricks was quiet for a moment. "She'll be there." "You sure?" Hendricks thought about the range, about the target with 3 rounds through one hole, about the way Marcus Chen, a man who did not impress easily and did not say things he didn't mean, had folded that paper with the careful gravity of someone handling something significant. "Yeah," he said, "I'm sure." Webb looked back at his map card. "I've never worked with a solo overwatch at that distance before." "Neither have I." "How do we know she's got comms up? How do we know she's in position? How do we know?" "We don't," Hendricks said. "That's the job." Webb absorbed that and said nothing else, because he was 28 years old and he was a good operator, and he understood the fundamental truth that Hendricks had just delivered. At a certain level of operational complexity, you have to extend trust to people you've only barely met, because the alternative is paralysis, and paralysis gets people killed. The helicopter banked left, 12 minutes to insertion, 6 kilometers away in darkness that had weight and texture. In the particular cold of Afghan mountain altitude, she was already in position. She had covered the ground from the landing zone in 26 minutes, a pace that would have pushed most trained soldiers to their limit in daylight on flat terrain. She had done it in the dark on a 40-degree slope with a rifle system on her back and a pack that weighed 31 pounds. And she had done it without a light, navigating by terrain memory and the faint starlight that filtered between cloud banks. She settled into the primary position, a natural rock formation at grid reference 479 or alpha that she had identified from the map and confirmed from memory, and began her pre-engagement sequence with the quiet efficiency of someone performing a ritual they have performed so many times it has become something close to prayer. Rifle out of the case, scope checks, wine readings. She held up a fine thread she kept in her chest pocket for exactly this purpose, and watched its movement against the stars. 12 knots northeast, consistent with her pre-mission calculation. She adjusted mentally and filed it. Range calculations run twice. Confirmed. She keyed her radio softly. Ghost actual on position grid 479er alpha. Ready. A 3-second pause. Then Pollock's voice in her ear, low and controlled. Copy ghost. Insertion in 11 minutes. Stand by. Standing by, she said, and then she went still. Not the stillness of someone waiting. The stillness of someone who has arrived at the place where everything she is and everything she is trained to be converges into a single sustained point of readiness. The kind of stillness that most people spend their entire lives never experiencing, because it requires you to have stripped away everything that isn't the mission, everything that isn't the job, everything that isn't the one specific thing you were built to do. She lay behind that rifle in the dark at 1,900 meters from a fortified compound. She couldn't see yet, only knew, and she breathed slowly and waited and watched. Below her and to the south, invisible to her, but mapped precisely in her mind, the insertion zone was coming up fast. The helicopters flared. Boots hit the ground. The mission was active. Pollock's voice again. Assault elements ground, 2 mics to compound perimeter. Ghost, you have anything on the eastern slope? She had her eye to the scope. The compound had lights, dim ones, the yellowish glow of a generator-powered setup visible through her night vision-compatible optic as bright bloom against the dark landscape. She could see 2 sentries on the northern wall. One on the southern roof, a position she hadn't expected, a 4th figure stationary at the eastern gate. Ghost to Pollock, she said quietly. Eastern gate, 1 sentry previously unreported. I have him. Do not engage until I have assault team and compound approach. Confirm. Confirmed. Hold eastern gate. She tracked the figure at the eastern gate. He was leaning against the wall, bored cold, probably underpaid, and overestimating the invulnerability of the position he was guarding. He had no idea that there was a woman on a ridge almost 2 kilometers away watching him breathe. 90 seconds. That was how long it took the assault team to cross the open ground from their insertion point to the compound's outer perimeter. 90 seconds during which she watched the eastern gate sentry, watched the roof sentries, watched the dark spaces between the walls where someone could emerge from shadow, and held all of it in her mind simultaneously with the patience and precision of a system designed for exactly this load. And then the radio crackled and Pollock said, breach in 30, ghost, clear your angles. She made one final adjustment for wind that a gust had picked up in the last 20 seconds, shifting to 14 knots, half a knot above her baseline, and settled her crosshairs. Eastern gate clear, she said. The sentry at the eastern gate ceased to be a threat. The sound of the shot, such as it was, dissolved into the mountain air long before it could reach the compound. Suppressed fire at this distance was to the people inside that compound indistinguishable from silence. What they would hear, if anything, was the very last thing, and by then nothing would need to be said. Eastern gate down, she said. Flat, professional, moving immediately to the next angle. Copy, Pollock said, then breach. The assault began. What followed was not chaos, it only looked like chaos from the outside. From inside it, from the perspective of the operators who had planned this with the precision of surgeons and were now executing it with the controlled aggression of people who had compressed 6 months of training into a 90-second window, it was a sequence, a brutal, elegant, human sequence. The breach team went through the southern wall. The extraction team moved immediately left toward the building intelligence had identified as the hostage location. Rangers held the outer perimeter. Delta covered the internal courtyard. SEALs pushed for the primary target. From 1,900 meters away, she watched all of it, and none of it because her job was not the interior. Her job was the exterior. Her conduit was the world beyond the compound walls, the approaches, and the roads and the ridgelines from which a counterattack could emerge. And that was when the radio frequency she'd been half monitoring on a secondary channel came alive with something she hadn't expected. It was Farsi, fast, urgent, broken. A transmission that could only mean one thing. Someone inside that compound had gotten a radio call out before the breach was complete. She keyed to the primary channel. Ghost to Pollock. I'm reading what sounds like an outbound transmission from inside the compound. Pre-breach or at breach. Someone may have made a call. 3 seconds of silence that felt like 3 minutes. Then Pollock's voice tighter than before. Can you confirm? Negative. I caught the tail end. But if they got a call out, you could have reinforcements from the Eastern Valley Road in. She did the calculation instantly. 14 to 18 minutes. Copy. Delta, you copy that. A Delta voice came back. Copy. Pushing extraction. She was already shifting her scope to the Eastern Valley Road. A single-lane dirt track that ran through a gap in the ridgeline 2 kilometers to her right, the only viable approach from the east. In the dark, vehicle headlights would be visible from her position a full 3 minutes before they reached the compound. She had planned for this. She had flagged it in the brief. She had known from the moment she studied that map that the eastern road was the variable no one could fully control. She watched the road. Inside the compound, the mission was moving fast. Too fast, not in a good way. Intel had assessed 12 to 20 fighters. The breach team was already reporting contact with more than that. 16 confirmed pushing hard against the SEAL element. Doyle's Rangers were taking fire from a position on the northern wall that hadn't appeared on any of their maps. Ghost Doyle, I've got a rooftop gunner northern wall angle 270 from your position. Can you? I don't have angle on 270 from primary, she said immediately. She was already moving, not running, but shifting position with controlled urgency, relocating 40 meters along the ridgeline to a secondary position she had identified during her initial setup. Give me 20 seconds. We're taking our 20 seconds, Sergeant Doyle. She moved. She settled. She acquired. The rooftop gunner on the northern wall was visible, just barely a heat bloom through her optic against the cold stone. 1,940 meters. Wind had shifted again. She could feel it. She compensated. 18 seconds after her transmission, she fired. Northern wall clear, she said. Doyle's voice came back, and beneath the professional control of it, she could hear something that might have been relief. Copy that, thank you. She was already repositioning back to primary because the eastern road was still her first responsibility, and she had just spent 20 seconds not watching it. She got back to primary and checked the road. Nothing yet. She exhaled. 12 minutes into the mission, the extraction element reached the hostages. 2 American contractors, dehydrated and frightened but mobile. The transmission that came through from the Delta team leader had the particular compressed urgency of someone who needs to convey maximum information in minimum words. 2 packs ambulatory moving to extract. Copy, Pollock said. All elements, we are in extract. 8 minutes. 8 minutes. She looked at the eastern road, and then she saw them. 2 sets of headlights. Moving fast. Distance she calculated immediately, approximately 4 kilometers from the compound. Time to arrival at current speed, 7 minutes. 7 minutes versus 8. Goes to all elements, she said. Her voice was completely level. 2 vehicles eastern road, approximately 4 clicks out. Moving at speed. ETA 7 minutes or less. You need to be outside that compound in 6. The radio erupted. Not in panic, in the rapid overlapping efficiency of people who have trained for this exact type of contingency and are now executing it at full speed. Pollock was coordinating extraction. The SEAL element was collapsing toward the southern breach point. Rangers were establishing cover. Delta had the hostages moving. 6 minutes. She kept her eye on the road. The vehicles were moving faster than her initial estimate. She corrected. Ghost to all. Update ETA, now 6 minutes, possibly less. Vehicle 1 appears to be a technical. Vehicle 2, hard to confirm, possibly transport. A technical meant a truck with a mounted weapon. That changed the math significantly. Can you stop them? Webb's voice. Young controlled, but she could hear the edge of what he was actually asking underneath the professional language. Can you stop them before they reach us? When they come through the gap in the ridgeline, she said, I'll have angle approximately 90 seconds before they reach compound. What's your confidence? She paused, not because she was uncertain, but because she was being precise. High. Define high. I have stopped vehicles at this distance before, Lieutenant. A beat of silence. Then copy. She watched the headlights come. She watched them move through the valley below, tracked their speed, recalculated twice adjusted for the angle she would have when they came through the ridge line gap. The gap was a natural choke point 30 meters wide, bordered on both sides by rock faces that would channel the vehicles into a predictable line. She had known about that gap since she first looked at the map. She had planned for exactly this, 4.5 minutes to compound. The assault team was at 3 minutes to cleared extract. The math was too close, and she was the variable that made it work or didn't. The first vehicle entered the gap. She fired. The shot hit the engine block. The vehicle stopped moving. It didn't crash dramatically, it just stopped momentum bleeding out over 15 meters as it rolled to a halt across the road, blocking the gap. Vehicle 1 stopped, she said, road blocked. The second vehicle, unable to see what had happened in the darkness, came up fast behind the first. She heard distantly the sound of brakes, the driver realizing, too late, that the road ahead was blocked. She fired again. Vehicle 2 disabled. You have time. A transmission came back from Pollock, and in his voice for the first time all night, she heard something that wasn't pure tactical focus. It was brief, it was controlled, but it was their ghost copy that. Outstanding. She said nothing. She was already scanning back to the compound because the mission wasn't done, and outstanding was a word for after. And right now there was no after, only the next 60 seconds and the one after that, and the one after that, until every American on that ground was back on a helicopter and climbing. The extract sequence unfolded with the controlled urgency of people who are very good at their jobs under conditions that would destroy most people. Rangers collapsed in sequence. The SEAL element came out of the breach point with the hostages between them. Delta provided cover in the southern approach, while the helicopters, which had been holding at a standoff position 3 kilometers out, were called in. She watched every approach, every angle, every dark space between structures where something could emerge. Nothing emerged. The helicopters touched down. People loaded fast, the practiced, graceless efficiency of combat extraction, where nobody looks elegant because nobody has time to look elegant. Hostages first, then casualties, if any. There were 2 Rangers with non-critical wounds walking, then the assault elements in reverse order of entry. Pollock was last on. He always was. It was the kind of thing you learned about a person only after you'd seen them work. The helicopters lifted. She watched them go from 1,900 meters away, 2 small lights rising against the dark sky, climbing and banking south toward FOB Rhino. She was alone. She began her breakdown sequence. Rifle back into the case. Scope covers on. Magazine secured. Brass she had collected every casing precisely counted packed. She would police the position completely because that was professionalism and that was security. And that was how you made sure the work you'd done tonight couldn't be traced back to a position that somebody might want to understand. It took her 11 minutes. Then she picked up her gear and started walking back toward the extraction LZ, where a helicopter would come for her separately, always last, always the part of the operation that happened after the operation was already being written up. She walked through the Afghan night alone with a rifle on her back and 17 confirmed engagements behind her, and no one to talk to, and no one watching, and no applause, and no acknowledgement, and she walked the way she always walked, when the mission was over, with the steady, unhurried pace of someone who has done exactly what they came to do and has no particular feelings about whether anyone noticed. But she was human. And in the dark between one footfall and the next, she let herself feel something she never showed anyone, not relief exactly, but the thing adjacent to relief. The exhale that happens at a cellular level when you have been running on maximum capacity for hours and the requirement finally ends. The quiet internal knowledge that the people she had spent the night protecting were on helicopters were going home. We're going to have coffee in the morning and call their families and complain about the food and live the ordinary days that ordinary life is made of. That was the reason, not the record, not the reputation, not the clearance level on a laminated card that made young gate guards go pale. Not the way Marcus Chen had folded that paper target like it was something worth keeping. The reason was the people on those helicopters. The reason had always been the people on those helicopters. She came over a rise in the terrain and stopped for a moment looking south toward FOB Rhino, where lights were beginning to come on in the pre-dawn dark, the base waking up the return of the mission, the activity that surrounds people coming back from somewhere they might not have come back from. The helicopter for her was still 12 minutes out. She sat down on a rock, set her rifle case beside her, and looked at the sky. The stars over Afghanistan at this altitude and at this hour were extraordinary. The kind of display that the ambient light of civilization permanently erases from the sky above most of the places people live. She had seen this sky many times in Iraq, in Syria, in the other places whose names she wasn't authorized to confirm. In all of them, the stars had been like this absolute indifferent, and in their indifference somehow comforting. Her radio crackled. Pollock's voice. Ghost all elements are wheels down. Everyone accounted for. Hostages secure. A pause, then quieter something that was not quite part of the standard operational transmission format. We wouldn't have made it without you tonight. She looked at the stars. That's the job, she said. Pollock didn't respond right away. When he did, he said only, your bird is 14 minutes out. Safe extraction, Chief Warrant Officer. Copy, she said. Out. She sat in the dark with the mission behind her and the helicopter coming and 17 confirmations that would never appear in any public document, and she breathed the cold mountain air and waited. 14 minutes. She had waited longer. The helicopter set her down at FOB Rhino at 0412 hours. She was the last person back on base. That was always how it worked. The overwatch comes in after everyone else because the overwatch stays until everyone else is safe, and safe means wheels up and climbing, not just out of the compound. She had watched those two helicopters disappear into the southern sky from her rock on the ridgeline, and she had sat there in the dark and the cold for 14 minutes until her own bird came. And now she was stepping off onto the tarmac at FOB Rhino with her rifle case in one hand and 31 pounds of gear on her back and 17 confirmed engagements in the last 4 hours, in the particular kind of exhaustion that lives not in the muscles, but somewhere deeper in the part of a person that has been running at full intensity for so long that coming down from it feels almost physical, like descent. She expected nothing when she landed. That was not self-pity, it was experience. In 19 years, the pattern had been consistent. She arrived alone, she worked alone, she came back alone, and the debrief happened in a room where the people asking questions were more interested in what she had done than in how she was. That was the job. She had made her peace with it so long ago that the peace had become its own kind of comfort. So when she stepped off that helicopter and looked toward the tarmac, what she saw stopped her mid-stride. They were standing in formation, not snapped to attention, not the rigid ceremonial formation of a parade ground. This was different. This was the formation of men who had walked back in from something real and had made a collective unspoken decision to be standing in a specific place when a specific person stepped off a specific helicopter. SEALs, Rangers, Delta operators. The two Rangers who had taken wounds tonight were standing with the rest of them, one with his arm in a field dressing, neither of them anywhere near where the medical team had tried to keep them. Pollock was there. Webb was there. Walsh, who had been the first one to dismiss her in the TOC, was there. Doyle, who had questioned her at the briefing table, was there. And Bull Hendricks, 6'4", and built like something that had been poured rather than assembled, was standing with his hands at his sides and an expression on his face that she had not seen on him before. She stood on the tarmac and looked at all of them and said nothing because there was nothing to say that wouldn't diminish what was happening. Then he stepped forward. Commander Jake Morrison, callsign Reaper, SEAL Team 6, commanding officer, a man whose reputation in the special operations community had been built over 2 decades of operations that would never appear in any official record, walked out of the formation toward her. He was not a man who moved casually. Every movement he made had been trained into precision. He stopped 3 feet in front of her. He raised his right hand to his cover in a salute. Not quickly, not as a formality, with the full deliberate weight of a senior officer rendering honors to someone who had earned them, the kind of salute that the military uses to communicate what words frequently cannot. She looked at him for 1 second, one full second during which the tarmac was completely silent, except for the cooling tick of the helicopter engine behind her. Then she shifted her rifle case to her left hand, straightened, and returned the salute. Behind Morrison, one by one, every operator on that tarmac raised their hand. It took about 4 seconds for all of them to complete it. 4 seconds that contained compressed, in wordless, everything that the last 14 hours had been the dismissal at the gate, the laughter in the TOC, the skepticism at the briefing table, the range and Marcus Chen, folding that target paper, the dark mountain in the radio, and the 17 shots, and the vehicles stopped in the ridgeline gap, and the helicopters lifting, and the people going home. 4 seconds. She held her salute until the last hand came down. Then she lowered hers. Morrison dropped his arm and looked at her, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that only she and the people immediately around them could hear it. "Chief Warrant Officer Reyes," he said, "on behalf of every person standing on this tarmac, thank you." She met his eyes. "Bring them home next time too," she said. "That's all I ask." Morrison held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once with the particular gravity of a man who understands that some statements don't require elaboration. She walked through the formation toward the TOC, and the operators parted for her the way water parts naturally without effort, because the thing moving through them had earned the right of passage in a way that required no announcement. Nobody spoke until she was inside. Then the tarmac slowly came back to life, voices and movement, and the low exhale of adrenaline finally being released, men turning to each other with the restrained, exhausted relief of people who have come back from somewhere they might not have come back from. But the conversations that started on that tarmac in the next few minutes were different from the conversations that had started in the TOC 14 hours earlier. Quieter, more careful, as if the men having them understood that something had shifted in their understanding of the world, and they were still in the process of absorbing exactly what it meant. Pollock found Hendricks near the edge of the tarmac. 1,900 meters, Hendricks said. He said it the way you say something you're still not entirely sure is real. 2,200 on the vehicle shots, Pollock said. Hendricks shook his head slowly. Not in disbelief he had seen it. He shook his head the way a person does when they are confronted with something that requires them to restructure a significant piece of their worldview. "I've been doing this for 16 years, he said. "I've worked with the best shooters in the community. I've been downrange from some of the finest precision fire ever executed in combat." He paused. "I have never seen anything like what happened tonight." Pollock said nothing. "And we were laughing at her when she walked in," Hendricks said. His voice had something in it that wasn't quite shame, more like the particular discomfort of a man who was honest enough to name what he did and disciplined enough not to make excuses for it. "We were actually laughing." "Yeah," Pollock said. "She never said a word about it." "No, not once." Hendricks looked toward the TOC. "Not in the brief, not at the range, not tonight." He shook his head again. "She just did the job." Pollock put his hands in his jacket pockets. "That's all she's ever done," he said. Hendricks looked at him. "You knew about her before tonight." "I knew of her," Pollock said carefully. "There are names that circulate in certain circles when people talk about who's genuinely elite. Not the officially recognized names, not the people who've been written about. The other names." He paused. Hers was one of them. I'd heard it in 2 different theaters from 2 different people I trust completely in the context of missions that were described as, he chose the word deliberately, impossible. "And you didn't say anything in the brief. Would it have mattered?" Hendricks was quiet for a moment. "Probably not," he said. "We'd have wanted to see it for ourselves anyway." He exhaled. "That's our problem, isn't it? We have to see it." "Human nature," Pollock said. "Bad human nature." "Yes," Pollock said. "That too." Inside the TOC, the debrief had already begun. Major Kraft was at the front of the room with a tablet and a recording device, working through the sequence of the operation with the methodical precision of someone whose job is to convert the chaotic reality of combat into the clean, documented language of an after-action report. The assault team leaders gave their accounts in sequence, timing, contacts, decision points, outcomes. When it came to Overwatch, Kraft looked at her. She was sitting along the same wall she had occupied the previous morning, still in her gear, still with her rifle case beside her, still with the composed, unreadable expression that seemed to be her default state in rooms full of people watching her. Chief Warrant Officer Reyes, Kraft said, "For the record, can you walk us through your engagements from primary and secondary positions?" She looked at him steadily. 17 engagements, she said. 13 from primary position at grid 479 or Alpha 4 from secondary position, offset 40 meters northeast of primary. Eastern Gate Sentry at mission initiation, 203 seconds prior to breach. Rooftop gunner northern wall engaged from secondary at 1,940 meters. Multiple fighters in the eastern courtyard approached during active breach, engaged sequentially. 2 reinforcement vehicles disabled at the Ridgeline Gap engine block, shots 2 rounds total. Remaining engagements were perimeter and approach contacts during extraction sequence. She paused. 0 misses, 0 friendly fire incidents, 0 weapons malfunctions. The room was very quiet. Kraft was writing. He was writing fast because the information she was delivering was precise and sequential and didn't require clarification. But his pen slowed slightly at the last line, 0 misses, and he looked up at her. 0 misses, he repeated, at distances up to 2,200 meters. Correct. He looked at her for a moment. Then he wrote it down. For the record, he said, this will be classified at the appropriate level and attributed to, he checked something on his tablet, an unspecified Overwatch element. That's standard, she said. Yes, he paused. It doesn't seem adequate under the circumstances. She looked at him with something that might in another context have been the beginning of a smile. It never does, she said. Write it up correctly and move on. That's all we can do. Kraft nodded and moved to the next section of the debrief. Doyle, sitting 2 seats down from where he'd been the night before, was watching her. He had been watching her with that particular quality of attention since she'd walked through the formation on the tarmac. The attention of someone who has revised a significant opinion and is still living inside the revision, still feeling the edges of it, still trying to understand exactly how wrong he'd been and what that wrongness meant about him. After the debrief broke up, he caught her near the door. Chief Warrant Officer. He said it differently than he'd said it the day before. The difference was subtle, a fraction of a second of additional weight, but she heard it. She stopped. Doyle was not a man who apologized easily. You could see it in him, the particular set of the jaw that belongs to someone for whom admitting error is a physical effort, not because they're arrogant, but because they've built their identity around being right, around being competent, around being the person in the room who knows what they're talking about. And she had walked into that briefing and quietly, without drama, without a single word of resentment, demonstrated that his assessment of her had been completely and fundamentally wrong. I misjudged you, he said. Simple, direct, no qualification attached to it. She looked at him for a moment. You made an assessment based on available information, she said. The available information was what she looked like, he said. That's not an assessment, that's a bus. She held his gaze. Yes, she said, it is. He absorbed that without flinching. I owe you an apology. You owe it to yourself, she said, to figure out why you made that call. Because the next time someone walks into a briefing room who doesn't look the part, she paused. It might not be someone whose job is to save your life. And the judgment you made about me, you'll make about them too. Doyle stood there with that for a moment. The directness of it, no softening, no performance of forgiveness, just a clean statement of the truth and a point that was worth sitting with. He nodded. Fair, he said. Get some sleep, Sergeant Doyle, she said. You did good work tonight. She moved past him and out the door. He stood in the TOC doorway and watched her go with the expression of a man who had just been taught something significant by someone he'd dismissed as irrelevant less than 24 hours earlier and who was honest enough with himself to feel the full weight of that. It was Walsh who told the story to Chen. Sergeant Major Marcus Chen had watched the formation on the tarmac from a distance. He hadn't been on the mission, hadn't been entitled to stand in that line, but he had seen it from the edge of the landing area and understood immediately what it meant. He had gone to his bunk after that and slept the sleep of someone who has been around long enough to recognize when history, even small, classified, unrecorded history, happens in front of them. Walsh found him in the mess at 700, sat down across from him with 2 cups of coffee and the particular expression of someone who needs to process something out loud. Tell me about her, Walsh said. Chen looked at him over his coffee. Tell you what, anything, everything. How does someone... Walsh stopped. Started again. At the range yesterday, you said you'd never trained her, so how does someone get to that level without going through the standard pipeline? Chen was quiet for a moment. He drank his coffee. He was a man who chose his words with the same care he had once chosen his shots, deliberately with full awareness of where they would land. There are people, he said finally, who emerge from the standard pipeline and go further, much further, on their own, through experience, through a particular kind of internal drive that training can develop but cannot create. I've met 3 of them in 22 years. He set his coffee down. And there are people who exist outside the pipeline entirely, programs that don't advertise units, that don't appear on official organizational charts, training regimens that exist in documents most people at this base don't have clearance to read. Chief Warrant Officer Reyes, based on what I've seen, is one of those people. Walsh stared at him. A black program. I didn't say that. You implied it. Chen looked at him with the expression of someone who implied it and has no intention of unimplying it. What I will say, he continued, is that what she demonstrated at that range, and apparently demonstrated again last night, based on what I'm hearing, he paused, is the kind of capability that doesn't come from standard training cycles. It comes from years, probably more years than most people on this base have been in uniform. And it comes from a level of operational experience that, if it were documented and publicly attributed, would make her one of the most accomplished precision operators in the history of the United States military. Walsh was quiet. And she's been doing this the whole time, he said slowly. Just doing this, unacknowledged. That's the nature of the work, Chen said. Doesn't that... Walsh stopped. Doesn't that bother her? Chen looked at him. Did it seem to bother her? Walsh thought about the woman who had walked through their formation on the tarmac with her rifle case and 31 pounds of gear, and an expression of absolute composure, who had returned Morrison's salute with the measured dignity of someone receiving what was simply her due, not greedily, not desperately, but calmly, the way you receive something that you never required, but that doesn't surprise you when it arrives. No, Walsh said, it didn't. There's your answer, Chen said. Walsh looked down at his coffee for a moment. I laughed at her, he said. When she walked into the TOC, I was one of the first ones. Chen regarded him without visible judgment. And now, Walsh looked up. Now I'm trying to figure out what kind of man laughs at someone like that. Chen was quiet for a long moment. The ordinary kind, he said finally. The kind who makes decisions based on what they see instead of what they don't. The kind who assumes that the people who belong in a room look a certain way. He paused. The kind that all of us are until something or someone teaches us otherwise. He picked up his coffee again. The question isn't what kind of man laughs at her. The question is what kind of man you decide to be after you stop laughing. Walsh said nothing. The fact that you're sitting here asking the question, Chen said, is not nothing. They sat in silence for a while after that, the 2 of them in the mess at 700 with cold coffee and the particular quality of morning that follows a night when something significant happened, the kind of morning where everything looks the same as it did, but nothing actually is. She was in the equipment room when Pollock came to find her for the last time. She was already packed. Everything squared away, tagged, accounted for. She was sitting on a crate with a small notebook on her knee, writing something in the close, precise handwriting that she used for mission notes, the private kind, the ones that never went in the official record, the ones she kept for herself as a kind of accounting. Not of kills, she never cataloged kills, of decisions, of moments where the calculation had been difficult and the outcome had been the right one. She had been keeping this accounting for 19 years, and the notebooks were stored in a location that only she knew about, and she had never shown them to anyone, and she never would. Pollock sat down across from her. Your transport is at 1400, he said. I know. He looked at her notebook for a moment without asking about it. Commander Morrison is requesting a formal commendation submission, he said, for your file. She didn't look up. Tell him I appreciate it. He's going to submit it regardless of what you say. Then he doesn't need my input. Pollock watched her write for a moment. Is there anything he started, stopped, started again? Is there anything you need before you go? She looked up. It was a genuine question. She could see that in his face. Not protocol, not a closing formality, a real question from a man who in the space of one night had moved from professional respect to something closer to the particular regard you have for someone you've been through something real with. "I'm good," she said. And then because he had asked genuinely and she responded to genuine things genuinely, "Thank you for last night, on the radio." He understood immediately what she meant. The transmission after the helicopters lifted. "We wouldn't have made it without you tonight." "I meant it," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why it mattered." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the comfortable silence of people who have earned it. Then Pollock said quietly, 19 years. 19 years, she confirmed. "How many more?" She looked at him with the level gaze of someone who has thought about this question and arrived at an answer they're at peace with. "As many as they need me," she said. Pollock nodded slowly. He stood. He looked at her one more time, this small, quiet woman in civilian clothes with a rifle case and a notebook and 19 years of classified history written in the lines around her eyes that you only saw if you were looking for them. "It's been an honor," he said. She closed the notebook. "Take care of your people, Master Sergeant," she said. He left. She sat alone in the equipment room with the notebook in her hands and the transport at 1400 and the morning light coming under the door and the whole weight of the night behind her and the whole long road of 19 years that had brought her to this room, this mission, this particular morning. She opened the notebook again. She wrote one more line. Then she closed it, stood up, picked up her gear, and walked toward whatever came next. She was gone by 1400 hours. No ceremony, no send-off. The same way she had arrived quietly in a vehicle that pulled up to the equipment bay, loaded her gear, and moved toward the flight line without announcement. The gate guard who processed her departure was a different Marine from the one who had processed her arrival, and he checked her credentials with the careful efficiency of someone doing his job correctly, and he handed her card back without a word, and she drove through the gate and was gone. FOB Rhino did not immediately return to normal. That was the thing nobody had anticipated, that her absence would feel different from her arrival. When she had walked through that gate yesterday morning, the base had absorbed her with skepticism and mild irritation. When she left, something went with her. Not a presence exactly, more like a standard, a raised bar that nobody had asked to be raised and that nobody could now pretend hadn't been raised. Bull Hendricks felt it first in the concrete way that people who process things physically tend to feel abstract truths. He was in the gym at 1600 going through a routine he had done 1,000 times, and somewhere in the middle of it, he stopped. Just stopped. Put the weight down and stood there and thought about a woman lying on a mountain ridge at 1900 meters in the dark alone, covering 17 men she had never met before yesterday morning, with a precision that the people who had laughed at her couldn't have matched in optimal conditions in daylight. He didn't finish the workout. He went back to his bunk and sat on the edge of it and thought for a long time about what kind of operator he was and what kind he wanted to be. That was the thing about being confronted with genuine excellence. It didn't make you feel celebrated. It made you feel measured. And the measurement, if you were honest about it, told you things you couldn't unknow. Morrison was in his office at 1700 when the secure line rang. He had been expecting the call. After an operation with those casualty numbers 0 and those outcome metrics, 2 hostages recovered, high-value target, neutralized, 0 friendly casualties. There was always a call, usually within 24 hours. The call came from people above Morrison's level, which was already several levels above where most people's careers ended. And it came in the particular tone of people who are accustomed to receiving good news but are not accustomed to news this good. "Walk me through the Overwatch element," the voice on the line said. No preamble, no pleasantries. That was how these calls worked. Morrison walked through it. He was precise and sequential the way he always was, and he included everything: the arrival, the skepticism in the TOC, the range demonstration, the mission execution, the engagement count, the vehicle interdiction, the extraction facilitation. Silence on the other end. Then, 17 engagements, 0 misses at those distances. Correct. "And this is Alexandra Reyes." "Yes, sir." Another silence. Longer this time. The kind of silence that means something is being processed at a level that requires more than a few seconds. "Commander Morrison," the voice said, "what I'm about to tell you is going to remain on this call and go no further. You understand that? Yes, sir. Chief Warrant Officer Reyes has been operating in a classification tier that most people at your level don't interact with directly. What happened at FOB Rhino last night is not the first time she has performed at this level. It is, however, the first time she has performed at this level in front of a joint element of this size. A pause. The question of whether that creates a documentation problem is one that people above both of us are currently discussing. Morrison absorbed this carefully. With respect, sir, a documentation problem, her record as it currently exists in accessible systems doesn't reflect her operational history. That's by design. The question is whether last night changes the calculus on that design. The voice paused again. 17 operators witnessed her performance. 2 of them are going to write about it in their personal journals tonight, even if we tell them not to. 4 of them are going to tell someone else within 6 months. That's not a security breach, that's human nature. And human nature, at scale, eventually becomes a record, even when there isn't one. Morrison was quiet for a moment. What are you asking me, sir? I'm not asking you anything. I'm informing you that a formal commendation submission for Chief Warrant Officer Reyes submitted through standard channels would land in a system that doesn't fully know what it's receiving. Another pause. I'm also informing you that the people above me are aware of last night and that the appropriate recognition will be handled through the appropriate channels. Your job is to make sure your element understands that what they witnessed is classified and remains so. They already know that, sir. Good, that's all. The line went dead. Morrison set the phone down and looked at his desk for a moment. He thought about the woman who had stood on his tarmac at 0412 and returned his salute with the composure of someone who had spent 19 years doing extraordinary things in classified places. And he thought about the voice on the phone saying her record doesn't reflect her operational history. That's by design. And he thought about what it meant to be that good for that long and to exist officially as almost nothing. He thought about it for a long time. Then he picked up a pen and began writing the commendation anyway. Because some things needed to be on paper somewhere, even if the paper lived in a drawer that very few people could open. Because the 17 operators on that tarmac had rendered honors to someone who had earned them. And that act deserved a written witness, even if the written witness never left this office. He wrote for 40 minutes. When he was done, he read it back once made, 2 corrections, signed it, and locked it in the secure drawer of his desk. It wasn't enough. He knew it wasn't enough. But it was what he could do, and doing it felt necessary in a way he couldn't have articulated to anyone who asked, so he didn't try. 3 time zones away, in a building whose address did not appear on any publicly accessible document, a woman sat across a desk from a man whose name would never appear in the account of what happened at FOB Rhino. The man had the particular stillness of someone who spent most of his professional life reading things that would disturb most people and had trained himself over many years to receive information without reaction. He slid a folder across the desk to her. She opened it, read it. Her eyes moved with the efficiency of someone who processes written information quickly and completely and doesn't need to read anything twice. She closed the folder. 17, she said. Correct. 0 misses. Also correct. She set the folder on the desk and looked at the man across from her. And the documentation question, being handled. He paused. The recommendation from above is that the record remains as is. The operational history stays in the tier it's in. The commendation Morrison submitted goes into the file at the appropriate classification level. She was quiet for a moment. And her opinion on that, the man across the desk looked at her with the expression of someone who finds a question both predictable and slightly beside the point. You know her opinion on that. Tell me anyway. He reached into the folder and produced a single sheet of paper, a transcript of a brief communication 3 lines long, transmitted through secure channels from an undisclosed location at 16:23 hours. He slid it across the desk. She read it. The first line was a reference number. The second line was a date and timestamp. The third line read classification appropriate. No further action required on my end. Reyes. She looked at the paper for a moment. Then she almost smiled, not quite, but the thing adjacent to it. Of course, she said. She's already on the next assignment, the man said. Briefed this morning, deploying in 72 hours. Where he looked at her with an expression that answered the question by not answering it. She nodded. Does she ever, she started, stopped. Does she ever ask for anything? The man across the desk considered this. It was not the kind of question he was typically asked, and it was not the kind of question his position typically required him to answer. But he considered it honestly because the woman across the desk from him had known Alexandra Reyes longer than almost anyone in this building. And honest consideration was what the question deserved. Once, he said, 3 years ago, after Mosul, he paused. She asked that the families of the operators she covered that night be told that their people came home because of good planning and good execution by good soldiers. He paused again. She didn't want any of them to know there had been an Overwatch element. The woman across the desk was quiet. She said the man reached for the exact words because they had stayed with him, that the families deserved to believe their soldiers had come home because of themselves, not because someone they'd never know about was watching from a ridgeline. He looked at the folder. She asked that we make sure the official account reflected the assault team's work, not hers. The woman across the desk looked at the transcript in her hand for a long moment. 3 lines. Classification appropriate. No further action required. Reyes. Who is she? She said, and she said it quietly, not as a question that needed an answer, but as the kind of statement that contains its own, the recognition that some people exist in a category that standard language doesn't quite reach, that the vocabulary most people use to describe courage and skill and dedication runs out somewhere before it gets to the place where Alexandra Reyes actually lived. The man across the desk said nothing. He didn't need to. Back at FOB Rhino the night after she left, something happened that nobody planned and nobody organized and nobody would have predicted 24 hours earlier. It started with Webb. Lieutenant Junior Grade Marcus Webb was 28 years old and from Georgia, and had the kind of internal life that people who looked at him from the outside would have been surprised by a thoughtful inner landscape that his exterior of quiet competence concealed effectively. He had been thinking about the night of the mission since he'd stepped off the helicopter, and he had been thinking about what she had said to Pollock on the radio, and he had been thinking about the formation on the tarmac and what it meant that every man standing in it had gone from dismissal to that in less than 24 hours. He was in the TOC at 2,000 hours writing his personal mission notes when he put down his pen and looked at the wall where the tactical map still hung, the same map she had described from memory without looking at it the day she arrived, and he felt something shift in his chest that he didn't have an immediate name for. He went and found Hendricks. I want to do something, he said. I don't know what, but something. Hendricks looked at him. What do you mean? For her record. For... Webb stopped. She's going to go do this somewhere else next week, and the week after that. And nobody's going to know. And I understand why. I understand the classification. But it feels wrong to just move on, like it didn't happen. Hendricks was quiet for a moment. What are you thinking? I don't know. A letter maybe from the team. Something that goes on record somewhere, even if it's a record nobody reads. Webb looked at him. You were the one who was most skeptical of her. I think it should come from you. Hendricks blinked. Me. You're the most senior SEAL element leader present, and you were the most vocal about doubting her. If it comes from you, it means something different than if it comes from someone who was convinced earlier. Hendricks stood there with that for a long moment. He had the look of a man being handed something heavy and deciding whether to take it. Then he said, all right. They found Pollock. They found Doyle. They found Walsh, who had spent the day in a state of quiet recalibration and who agreed immediately without hesitation in the voice of someone who has been waiting for exactly this opportunity. They found the 2 Rangers who had taken wounds and who had walked out of the medical bay specifically to stand in the formation on the tarmac and who understood without being told why they had done it. 7 men, sitting in the TOC at 21:30 hours in a circle of folding chairs in the room where she had been mocked and dismissed and then quietly permanently proven right. Hendricks held a legal pad and a pen. He looked around at the men in the circle. This doesn't go through official channels, he said. It goes into Morrison's hands and nowhere else. He decides what to do with it, but it gets written. Agreed. Everyone agreed. Then let's start, he said. Webb, you first. Webb thought for a moment. Then he said, write that she came into a room full of people who had already decided she didn't belong there, and she never once asked us to change our minds. She just showed us what she was, and what she was the reason we came home. Hendricks wrote it. Doyle went next. Write that I questioned her credentials in that briefing room, he said. His voice was flat and direct the way it always was when he was being most honest. And that I was wrong to do it. And that the standards she demonstrated, not just the shooting, but the entire way she operated, is the standard I'm going to hold myself to going forward. Write that, Hendricks wrote it. Walsh officials said, write that I laughed. I want it on record that I laughed, because if it's not on record, I can pretend I didn't, and I don't want to be the kind of person who pretends. He paused. And write that I will not do it again, to anyone. The room was quiet for a moment after that, the kind of quiet that happens when someone says something true that costs them something. Hendricks wrote it. Pollock said, write that in 20 years of special operations, I have worked with exceptional people. I have worked with people who were the best in their specialty, who were legends in specific communities, who had records that would not be believed if I described them in public. He paused. And that what I watched last night is in a category I don't have existing language for. Not better than the best I've seen. Different. Like comparing, he searched for it, like comparing a great surgeon to someone who operates in a burning building with one hand tied behind their back and still doesn't lose the patient. He stopped. Write that, however you want to write it. Hendricks wrote for a while, then he looked up. I'm going to add something from me, he said, if that's okay. Nobody objected. He looked at the legal pad, then he looked at the tactical map on the wall. Then he wrote and he read it aloud as he wrote, Chief Warrant Officer 5 Alexandra Reyes arrived at this base and was met with the kind of dismissal that diminishes the person delivering it more than the person receiving it. She performed her mission with a precision and dedication that none of us were prepared for and all of us were humbled by. She asked for nothing. She required nothing. She left before we could fully understand what we had witnessed. He paused. If there is a record of what happened at this base on this night, and it does not include her name, then the record is incomplete. And the incompleteness is our failure, not hers. She has always been complete. We were the ones who needed to catch up. He put the pen down. Nobody spoke for a while. Then Morrison's voice came from the doorway. He had come in quietly sometime in the middle of it, and nobody had noticed. Give me the pad, he said. Hendricks handed it across the room. Morrison read it. He read it slowly, the way you read something when you want to make sure you've received every word. Then he looked around at the 7 men in the circle of folding chairs. I'll add my name, he said, and I'll add it to what's already in my desk. He looked at the pad again. This is going into the file at the highest level I can access. It will not change her classification status. It will not appear in any public record, but it will exist. He paused. For whatever that's worth. Webb said quietly, It's worth something, sir. Morrison looked at him. Yes, he said, it is. He folded the legal pad, tucked it under his arm, and walked back toward his office. Behind him, the 7 men in the circle of chairs sat in the particular silence of people who have done a small thing that felt under the circumstances like the only right response to a very large one. She never knew about the letter. That was not an oversight. That was the nature of the work and the nature of the life and the nature of the woman who had chosen both. 72 hours after she left FOB Rhino, she was on another aircraft in another theater with another set of coordinates in her head and another mission brief memorized and another set of operators who would meet her and not know what they were looking at. The notebook she had written in that last morning at FOB Rhino was packed in the bottom of her kit alongside 6 other notebooks with the same close, precise handwriting, the same accounting of decisions and difficult moments and outcomes that had gone right. The notebooks were not records of kills. They were not records of missions. They were records of the moments where she had been most tested, most alone, most uncertain, most required to reach for the deepest part of what she was and had found something there. Every time, without exception. She had started keeping them in her 3rd year in Iraq, after a night that had been worse than last night, worse than anything at FOB Rhino. A night where the margin between the people she was covering and the outcome she had prevented had been so thin that she had sat in the dark afterward and understood for the first time in a way she could not rationalize away that this was what she was for. Not the rank, not the classification, not the commendations that lived in drawers. This, the being there when it mattered, the precision in the dark, the radio transmission that said everyone accounted for And the knowledge that accounted for was a word that meant alive, and alive was a word that had weight that most people never had to feel. That was the reason. That had always been the reason. 72 hours out of FOB, Rhino on an aircraft crossing into a new theater, she opened the notebook to the last entry she had made. The line she had written that last morning in the equipment room with Pollock's footsteps still fresh on the concrete outside, and the transport at 1400, and the whole weight of the night behind her. She read it once. Then she closed the notebook, put it away, and looked out the small porthole window at the world below mountains and distance, and the abstract geometry of terrain that she would be navigating in the dark in 72 hours, that she would memorize from maps and internalize and convert into angles and distances, and the specific patient knowledge of someone who had spent 19 years learning how to see what other people missed. The aircraft banked. Below her, the mountains came into view. She studied them the way she studied everything carefully, completely, with the full weight of her attention, and began in the quiet of her own mind to prepare. The notebook line she had written that last morning at FOB Rhino read, "They will remember. That is enough." She had written it without sentimentality, without performance, the way she wrote everything as a precise record of what was true. And it was true. The men on that tarmac would remember. The salute would live in their bodies the way physical things live, not as a memory exactly, but as a changed understanding of the world that expressed itself in small ways in unguarded moments. In the fraction of a second before judgment that determines whether a person sees what's actually in front of them or only what they expected to find. That was enough for her. It had always been enough. But the world, it turned out, had a different accounting in mind. 6 weeks after FOB Rhino, Marcus Webb was back in Virginia. Debrief cycles, medical checks, the standard reentry protocol that special operations personnel move through after deployment, a process designed to be thorough, and that felt to most of the people inside it like necessary friction between the world they'd been in and the world they'd come back to. He was sitting in a waiting room outside a debriefing suite when the man sat down next to him. The man was in civilian clothes. He had the kind of face that was designed to be forgotten, not unpleasant, not distinctive, the precise average of 1,000 faces. He held a paper coffee cup and looked at the wall across from him like someone waiting for their name to be called. "Lieutenant Webb," he said. Webb looked at him. "Do I know you?" "No." The man took a sip of his coffee. "I work in a building you have been cleared for, but never visited. I want to ask you something, and you don't have to answer, and I want you to know before I ask that your answer, whatever it is, won't affect your record or your standing." Webb studied him carefully. "All right. The night of the Helmand Valley operation, the Overwatch element." The man paused. "What would you say if you were going to say anything about what you witnessed?" Webb was quiet for a moment. He thought about the tarmac. He thought about the formation. He thought about sitting in the TOC at 21:30, writing that letter with 6 other men who had come in laughing and were leaving changed. He thought about what Hendricks had written. "She has always been complete. We were the ones who needed to catch up." "I would say," Webb said carefully, "that I have been a naval special warfare officer for 4 years. I expect to be one for another 20. And I will spend those 20 years trying to operate at the standard I witnessed that night." He paused. "And I will probably never fully reach it." The man with the forgettable face looked at him for a moment. "That's what I expected you to say," he said. He stood up, taking his coffee cup. "Thank you, Lieutenant." He walked out of the waiting room, and Webb never saw him again. And 3 weeks later, a document was added to a file in a classified database at a classification level so high that fewer than 40 people in the United States government could access it without a specific need-to-know authorization. The document was 4 pages long. It contained the accounts of 7 operators. It contained Morrison's commendation. It contained the results of 17 confirmed engagements at distances between 900 and 220 meters. 0 misses. 0 friendly casualties, 2 hostages recovered, 1 high-value target neutralized, and 1 reinforcement interdiction that had changed the outcome of the operation entirely. And at the top of the document, above all of it, was a name. Chief Warrant Officer 5, Alexandra Reyes. For the first time in 11 years, her full operational history, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, and the 4 other theaters whose names the document listed with the careful precision of official language, existed in a single place, not classified away from each other, not fragmented across systems that couldn't communicate. Together, complete. A record that matched at last the reality of what she had done and who she was. She didn't know the document existed. She was in a different country when it was written. She was doing the same thing she had always done. The mission in the new theater was different in specifics and identical in structure. The arrival, the room, the skepticism, the proof. By now that sequence had a rhythm she recognized, not with bitterness, not with exhaustion, with the particular equanimity of someone who has accepted a recurring condition of their existence and found that acceptance more useful than resentment. The room this time was smaller, a joint task force outpost, fewer personnel, higher average experience level. The skepticism was more contained, not laughter exactly, but the measured caution of people who had learned that their first impressions of assets weren't always reliable and who were nonetheless still operating on their first impression of her. There was a young Sergeant Army Rangers, couldn't have been more than 25, who approached her during the equipment check 2 hours before mission brief. His name was Torres. He had the particular energy of someone who had something to say and was working up to saying it. "Chief Warrant Officer," he said. She looked up from the scope adjustment she was making. "I heard about Hellman," he said, "about FOB Rhino." She went very still in a way that was different from her usual stillness, not guarded, curious. "Where did you hear about FOB Rhino?" Torres shifted his weight slightly. "Doyle," he said. "Sergeant First Class Doyle. He's my uncle. Well, not my uncle. He was my recruiter. He's the reason I enlisted." He paused. "He called me 3 weeks ago. He doesn't usually call. And when he does, he doesn't usually." Torres stopped looking for words that fit. "He's not a guy who talks about things that get to him. You know the type." She knew the type very well. "He talked about FOB Rhino for 40 minutes, Torres said. "He told me about the briefing room, about the range, about the mission." He paused again. "He told me what he said to you afterward, that he owed you an apology, and what you said back, that he owed it to himself." Torres looked at her directly now, past whatever hesitation had been in the way before. "He said that was the most useful thing anyone had told him in 15 years of service." She looked at Torres for a long moment, at his youth and his earnestness, and the particular quality of someone who has been shaped by a mentor, who was shaped by an experience, and who carries the shape of that shaping forward without fully understanding its origin. "Doyle is a good soldier," she said. "He told me to watch for you," Torres said. "He said if you ever end up in the same room as Alexandra Reyes, pay attention to everything. Not just the shooting, everything." She picked up the scope and went back to the adjustment. "Get your gear checked," she said. "Mission brief in 90 minutes. Torres stood there for one more second. "Yes, Chief Warrant Officer," he said. And then, because he was 25 and had been raised by people who express things directly, it's an honor. She didn't look up from the scope. But something in the line of her shoulders changed a fraction, barely visible, the way things change in people when they receive something genuine and aren't quite sure what to do with it. "Go get your gear checked, Torres," she said, quietly, not dismissing him, ending the moment before it became something heavier than either of them needed it to be. He went. She put down the scope and looked at the wall for a moment. Doyle had called his nephew, Walsh. She would later learn, though she would never be told directly, had gone back to his unit and spent 3 hours with his junior Marines talking about assumptions and confirmation bias and the specific damage done when you decide what someone is before you watch them work. Hendricks had submitted a revised training doctrine recommendation to his command, advocating for blind evaluation protocols and joint assessment exercises. The assessor not knowing the identity or background of the operator being evaluated until after the evaluation was complete. The recommendation was under review. Webb had requested assignment to a joint task force that specifically integrated mixed specialty Overwatch elements. He was currently 4th on the wait list. She did not know any of this directly. The work she had done at FOB Rhino was classified, and the people doing these things didn't announce them to her. And even if they had, she would not have claimed credit for changes in other people's behavior. You cannot claim credit for showing people who they already had the capacity to become. You can only do the work well enough that the becoming happens on its own. The mission in the new theater went the way missions go when the person on Overwatch is the best at the job who has ever done the job. Afterward, Torres found her at the equipment bay. He didn't have words. He just stood there for a moment, and she could see in his face the particular expression that she had seen on Bull Hendrix's face on the tarmac, the recalibration, the expansion of what a person believes is possible, the slightly stunned quality of having your understanding of human capability rearranged without warning. "Get some sleep," she told him. "Yes, Chief Warrant Officer." He paused. "How do you—" He stopped. "How do I what? How do you do it?" he said. The alone part, the nobody knowing. She looked at him for a long moment. He was 25 and sincere and asking a real question, and he deserved a real answer. "You find the thing that matters," she said. "Well, the recognition, the actual thing, the reason." She held his gaze. "For me, it's the radio transmission at the end. All elements accounted for. Every time I hear that, every single time, that's the whole reason." "Right there." She paused. "Find your reason. Everything else is just noise." Torres nodded slowly, the nod of someone writing something on a deeper surface than paper. She walked away. 2 months later, May was back in the United States for the first time in a long time. Not on leave, she didn't take leave the way most people did in structured blocks of time away from everything. She took it in small pieces, scattered and irregular, the way water finds its way through rock. She was in a nondescript building, in an undisclosed city, in a room she had been in before. Across the desk from the woman who handled her assignments and had known her longer than almost anyone in the program. The woman slid a folder across the desk. She opened it, read it. Her eyes moved efficiently the way they always did, missing nothing. She closed it. The folder contained the 4-page document, the complete operational history, her name at the top. Why, she said, just that. One word. "Because it's accurate," the woman across the desk said. "Because accurate records matter even when they're classified. Because someone above both of us decided that the accounting needed to be complete." She paused. "And because, frankly, it was overdue." She looked at the closed folder for a long moment. "Does this change my operational status?" "No." "Does it change my assignment pipeline?" "No." "Does anyone outside the access list ever see it?" "No." She sat with that for a moment. Then she said something that the woman across the desk had not expected despite knowing her for 11 years. "Good," she said. "Keep it that way." The woman blinked. "Most people? I'm not most people," she said. Not arrogantly, factually, the same way she delivered all her facts precisely without decoration. "If the record is accurate, then the record is doing its job. I don't need anyone to read it. I need it to be right." She looked at the folder again. "Is it right?" "Yes," the woman said. "It's right." "Then we're done." She stood, picked up her jacket. "What's next?" The woman across the desk looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had spent 19 years being the most important person in rooms full of people who didn't know she was there, who had covered hundreds of operators from distances that most people would have thought were impossible, who had never once asked to be recognized, and who had, in the months since Phobie B. Rhino, quietly and without intention or awareness, changed the behavior of at least 6 people who had gone on to change the behavior of others, rippling outward in the way that genuine excellence ripples not with noise, but with influence, not with announcement, but with example. "Syria," the woman said. 72 hours. She nodded. "Brief. Tomorrow morning is 0700. She put on her jacket. "I'll be there at 0645, she said. She walked to the door. Her hand was on the handle when the woman across the desk said quietly, "Alexandra." She stopped, turned slightly. "I want you to know," the woman said, "that I have read every after-action account of every mission you have been on for 11 years. Every one." She paused. "I have never once read an account where you were not the best person in the theater." Another pause longer, with more weight in it. "I just wanted you to know that someone knows." She stood at the door for a moment. The stillness in her was the specific kind that happens when something real lands in a place that has been carefully maintained against exactly this, the place where the professional and the human overlap, where the job ends and the person begins, where 19 years of discipline and classified excellence and solo mountain ridges and radio transmissions, saying all elements accounted for, had collected into something that was still underneath all of it. A woman who needed, even if she would never say so, even if she would never ask to know that the work had been seen. "Thank you," she said. 2 words, but they carried everything. She opened the door and walked out. And the woman across the desk sat alone with the closed folder and the empty chair, and the weight of 11 years of knowing someone who would never ask to be known, and she felt in a way that surprised her, despite the fact that it shouldn't have, that she had just witnessed something important. Not the salute on a tarmac, not the 17 shots in the dark, not the letter from the 7 operators that lived in a classified drawer. Something smaller and larger than all of those things combined. She had witnessed the moment when Alexandra Reyes received the one acknowledgement she had never received before in 19 years. Not that her work was extraordinary, but that she herself had been seen, not the operator, not the record, not the capability. Her, the person doing the work in the dark alone because it needed to be done, and she was the one who could do it best. That was the twist nobody expected. Not the record, not the document. The moment at the door with 2 words that cost more than 17 shots across a mountain valley because they required her to let something in that she had trained herself for 19 years to live without. She walked out of that building and into the afternoon light, and she kept walking. And behind her, the building held her complete history in a classified folder in a locked room. And ahead of her, Syria was 72 hours away. And somewhere between the building and Syria was the ordinary afternoon of an extraordinary woman who would never be ordinary and had never asked to be celebrated, and had simply relentlessly, impossibly shown up every time, in every theater, in every room that laughed at her, in every darkness that asked more than most people could give, and done the job better than anyone thought was possible. At FOB Rhino on the wall of the TOC, the tactical map had been replaced with a new one. Operational necessity, the old theater was cycling out new assignments coming in. But before Walsh took it down, he did something he couldn't fully explain afterward and didn't try to. He folded it carefully, the whole map along the grid lines that she had described from memory on the day she arrived, and he put it in his kit. Not as a souvenir, not as a keepsake in any sentimental sense, as a reminder, as the specific physical object that would sit in the bottom of his bag for the next 3 deployments and tell him every time he reached past it that the person he had laughed at had known that map better than he did before she had ever looked at it, and that the difference between that version of himself and the version he was trying to become was exactly that distance. The distance between what you assume and what you actually see. Torres called Doyle 2 weeks after the new theater mission. He didn't have a specific thing to report, no dramatic story, no single moment. Just the call and Doyle all but picking up and Torres saying, "I worked with her." Doyle was quiet for a moment. Then, and you were right, Torres said. About all of it. Doyle exhaled. A long, controlled exhale, the kind that carries more than air. "Did you watch everything, not just the shooting?" "Everything," Torres said. "Good." A pause. "That's the whole lesson, kid. Watch everything." She never knew about that phone call either. She didn't need to. The work was the record. The people who came home were the proof. The radio transmission, all elements accounted for, was the only acknowledgement she had ever required. And it was the one acknowledgement that no classification level could redact and no document could replace. She had built a career, a life on the understanding that the most important things happen in the dark, without witnesses, without applause, without the validation that most people need before they can commit fully to something difficult. She had built that understanding not from philosophy, but from experience. From 19 years of being the person nobody saw covering the people everybody else was watching, holding the thread that kept the whole operation together without ever appearing in the picture of it. And she had been right. The most dangerous weapons don't always look dangerous. The person you underestimate may be the one saving your life. She had said it once quietly to a room of operators who had spent a day learning that truth at her expense. She had not said it as a lesson or a lecture or a verdict on the men who had laughed. She had said it the way she said everything, precisely, cleanly, without decoration, because it was true, and truth was the only currency she had ever dealt in. It was true the day she said it. It had been true for 19 years before she said it. And it would be true long after the men who heard it had retired, and the bases had changed names, and the missions had been reclassified, and the documents had been locked in drawers that fewer and fewer people had the clearance to open. Because the truth of what she was did not depend on anyone knowing it. It never had. She had never been the outsider. She had always been the reason they survived. And she was already gone, already moving, already preparing, already studying the next set of mountains from the window of the next aircraft before any of them fully understood what it meant to have been in the same room as someone like her. Before any of them fully understood that the laughing and the dismissal and the questions and the doubt had not diminished her by a single degree, that she had walked into every room at full height and walked out the same way, unchanged by their judgment, because she had never required their validation to know exactly who she was and exactly what she was for. She was the ghost who came when the darkness was deepest. She was the stillness behind the chaos. She was the voice on the radio that said Eastern Gate clear and Northern Wall clear, and Vehicle 1 stopped and you have time, and she was the silence after the mission that asked for nothing and received nothing and went on anyway. She was Chief Warrant Officer 5 Alexandra Reyes, and she was already on her way to the next ridgeline, the next darkness, the next room full of people who hadn't seen her coming. She never needed them to.